Righty-ho. Right, we're just waiting for Nick Shepley, and we will get going. Today, quite an exciting, in fact, a really fascinating topic today, which is looking at heresy and orthodoxy and what the consequences are. So we're just going to make sure that Nick is joining us, and we will get going. So Nick, just let us know when you're online, and we will get going. Cool. Hi Nick, can you hear me? Let me just try again. Let me just invite you again, Nick. Let's just see what happens. Nick, let me just say something, Nick, so I can... that looks like you there. Nick, I can't hear you at the moment. Well, let me just see if there are any...
You don't... I'm here.
Ah, there you are. Cool.
Yeah.
Fab.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Have you just come on now? Have you, Nick?
Yeah. It's a bit of a new science to me, Google Hangouts. So I'm just kind of figuring it out as I go along, really. But
fantastic. Cool. Well, look. Well, we can. What I'll do is I'll just at the end.
Let me just say something next, so I can.
Yes. Can you hear me all right?
That looks like you there.
All right. Okay. We're getting some feedback from just something, Nick. Can
you hear me now better? Is that all right?
Yeah, that's better. That's cool. That's cool.
Okay. Magic. Right.
Fab. Nick, well, let me just introduce you, and then I will click over onto you as well.
Okay.
One thing I meant to say, which I will do for you next time, and you might be able to do now, it's a little bit of a faff, and we'll probably need about 20 minutes, but there's a little thing called the Hangouts toolbox on the left-hand side, and what I'll do is I'll get that set up for you next time.
Right.
I think it's something you have to install separately, but basically allows you to add a swanky picture on the bottom left, put your name and a little sort of your website underneath it. So
right.
It doesn't really matter, but it'll be nice. It'll probably be a nice one to just have on there for the future. Right. So let me introduce you, and we'll get going.
Okay, great.
Right, but so a little sip of water. Great. So we've got Nick Shepley here today, and Nick is a teacher, a journalist, and an author of 22 books, I think, to date on Amazon. He's got 75 podcasts out there on iTunes, and Nick suggested a topic today, which I'm really, really excited about, which is heretics and radicals and the consequences of orthodoxy. And this has just huge sort of implications and consequences for just about all of us. So I'm gonna pass you over to Nick now. And Nick, I'm just wondering, why is this such an important topic, and why is what is orthodoxy, and why is it so important to at least have an understanding of the fact that there is such a thing as orthodoxy?
Well, I think it's important for many reasons. I mean, we can talk about orthodoxy in many ways. If we look at the way economies are run, there are economists that believe rigidly, have almost a blind faith that certain solutions applied to the letter will create optimum outcomes, almost kind of utopian outcomes, where everyone will be happy and all our economic woes will be solved. You have political orthodoxies and obviously religious orthodoxies. And I think what orthodoxies are they are the literal readings of ideas without nuance, without kind of adaptation, without compromise to real-world situations. And those that believe in the orthodoxy say, if only we simply applied them more fundamentally, if only we simply went further down the line and were less sentimental in a way in enforcing this idea, then we reach the utopia. Whereas perhaps a more nuanced approach is to look at ideas from everything from religion to economics to politics to science and say, well, there are strengths in everything that we can see here, but we have to take into fact that the world isn't a book. The world isn't the Bible or the Communist Manifesto or the Origin of the Species. The world is the world. It's this very complicated and almost impossible to understand set of processes. And the things that we learn, we need to kind of apply nuance and avoid interpreting in the most literal ways. I think that's where orthodoxies are. I mean, I say not. I don't mean dangerous, but incredibly powerful. And if we look at the history of the 20th century, and we see the application of orthodoxies, I mean, the great example is communism. Communism is, you can look at it as being, people say, well, was it a kind of religion? Well, I suppose, well, it has a prophet with a big beard and a book of commandments, and followers who take on his work and suggest and sort of enforce it in literal ways. The one thing that Karl Marx never left behind was he explained capitalism. He actually came up with the term Das Kapital. He explained the workings of capitalism. He never quite said what communism would be like. So people like Lenin and Trotsky spent their time creating sort of interpretations in the most literal and very often very brutal senses of what communism could or should be. And I suppose that's where what we can see as orthodoxy. I mean, you probably find lots of people emailing and say, well, no, I think orthodoxy is something entirely different. So it's one of those kind of very, very big terms. But yes, so that's where I think it was hit. And the other, I mean, I guess the other, the more relevant aspect of orthodoxy to us, particularly economic, is the orthodoxy with which we see things like the working of markets. I mean, we have really in the Western world now, we have eliminated all other possibilities other than free market capitalism. And those that say there are two views, that markets unfettered are enormously destructive.
Mm.
And the view of market fundamentalists is say, well, no, we haven't unfettered them enough. That's the problem. We need to apply them ever more rigorously, and then we'll come to the optimum outcome. So that's an open. So that should get us started anyway.
Yeah, I mean, and I think what we're saying here is that there is these kind of things. I mean, part of their power, isn't it, that they're almost if they're unquestioned and you don't know which orthodoxy is whether we're looking at maybe history or economics, if we don't know which orthodoxy or set of orthodoxies is in the foreground or almost implicit, or perhaps even in the background, just kind of implicit in what's going on there, then that does create one particular view or worldview that could be perhaps either imbalanced or not showing the full picture, but which could appear to be the view of reality.
Well, this is it. I think a classic example of that is really the kind of the rise and fall of psychoanalysis in the 20th century. I mean, if you look at everything really from about the 1920s through to the 1970s, maybe the 1960s. So it starts to kind of lose its power in the mid-60s. But this view of really consciousness and reality, the Freudian psychoanalysis, really prevails, and so much. I mean, and so much is coloured by that fact. So much of the workings of, as you say, kind of culture, economics, politics, and philosophy, it's coloured by this fact that this is an orthodoxy. Well, this is how human beings actually are in their entirety. And whilst there may be something in psychoanalysis, much of it really wasn't kind of peer-reviewed science. It was, the observations of people like Freud and the post-Freudians that came after him. And yet, these are taken on board as orthodoxies and articles of faith. And if you were, say, looking back at the history of the 1960s, and you didn't know that people viewed this as being an absolute truth in many regards, you'd see all sorts of strange and quite puzzling facts, knowledge, events, documents, that kind of thing, evidence. And knowing that this one prevailing idea about how human beings are and about childhood and development and trauma and psychosis, knowing that coloured everything would give you excellent insights into why people were acting in the ways that they were during that period of time.
Yeah, and that's quite a just that one example. I mean, the ramifications of if in that case maybe the orthodoxy is a model, and the model is assumed to be is to map directly onto reality, almost to be a sort of a fact, and that can create, like you say, a certain set of limitations, and I think a lot of the stuff that's come after us is sort of maybe to get a bit more of a balance, and to modern science would undoubtedly look very differently, in many of our understandings, and so that probably has been updated in some ways. Well, I mean, what are some of the examples, if we're kind of looking today at kind of modern, before we kind of look at kind of the heretical side, but what are perhaps some of the modern orthodoxies, or are there some good kind of current examples of orthodoxies that are kind of that have great relevance, and that perhaps perhaps are kind of taken as fact?
Well, I mean, you can look. I suppose one orthodoxy that we can look at quite easily is the constant diet of slightly racist rhetoric we see from about 75% of the country's newspapers when it comes to questions of immigration. Now, unfortunately, it would appear at the moment, and I wish it were not like this, but it would appear at the moment that there are great assumptions being made about the threats of immigration, the cost of immigration, so on and so forth, and that our ways of life is under threat from some largely impoverished Romanian people and things like that. The kind of the public discourse about immigration from all of the major political parties, from most of the media, even from some more liberal ends like the BBC, they're still kind of articulating and repeating things as truth. But when you look into the actual the evidence of it, most of it is untrue. Most of it is untrue. That there is no, for example, if you take the example of this notion that health tourists raise money for the NHS, no, they don't. Firstly, what does be described as health tourists virtually don't exist. There are people that sure use the NHS as anyone would, as anyone either in an emergency would, or any use is entitled to. Actually, these people bring a net flow of money into the country, as do foreign students, as do foreign workers. I mean, the idea that a Polish electrician who has been raised, fed, educated, trained in Poland brings with him, literally hundreds of thousands of pounds of education and rearing. Nobody from Britain had to create this skilled worker to pay for him to exist. He simply enters our economy, and hey presto, he's fixing people's lights and that kind of thing. Now, the real issue is that there are people in Britain who feel challenged and threatened and worried by that. And you have, the real story is that globalization and the globalization of markets, particularly the globalization of labour markets, has worked very well for people to come in to work and to give all sorts of service and labour to the economy. But there is a certain section of the country that feels left behind, alienated and frightened and that kind of thing. Now, if we were to have a sensible conversation, if you try to reach out to those people and to help skill them, employ them, and that kind of thing, instead of the constant diatribe of fear and panic, of which is obviously going to have negative consequences, and obviously going to wind up exacerbating a tense situation. So we've got that's I guess that's an orthodoxy of post 2008. Prior to 2008, the orthodoxy was that globalization is the magic bullet. Tony Blair referred to it as the tide that lifts all boats. That the more free markets expand around the world, the more markets are opened up, the more we can all trade and trade between one another, the richer everyone's going to get. And it makes me mindful of the kind of rhetoric that was going around America before the Wall Street crash. The man who built the Empire State Building, a guy called John Ruskin, wrote a book called Everybody Should Be Rich. And he said basically, everybody, no matter if you are poor sharecropper in the deep south, if you buy shares and just hang on to them, they will always go up, and then you just buy more and more and more with the proceeds, and within 10 or 15 years you'll be rich. And it's just that simple. And there was a feeling in the early 1920s, really, that the stock market was a kind of magic. I paraphrase, obviously, but a kind of a magic that would create this mystical result. And we view markets, or did before 2008, I think, view markets in roughly the same way. And why wouldn't we? We were becoming, up to 2008, or maybe up to 2007, we were becoming better off. There was this never-ending housing boom. And it was fueled in one way by globalization. What we were getting was this huge inflation-busting, mountain of stuff coming from places like China. All the commodities we wanted to buy, kind of nice cups like this, were coming at a premium, and it was really, we were getting a large part of our standard of living from, unfortunately, Chinese sweated labour. Let's face it. So that orthodoxy kind of transformed after 2008 to new orthodoxies which are far more pessimistic, that our way of life is under threat, and that the wonders of globalization have actually turned around in bitterness, and now we need to pull up the drawbridge and hope Nigel Farage will save us all, and barricade and keep them out. And unfortunately, that is, I think, probably a fool's errand, really. So there are two, I think, that dominate us, and it's interesting that they're both economic, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that there was a great book, I recommend anyone watching this to go out and buy it, a book called Reappraisals by Tony Judd. And in the first chapter, he asked the reader why it was that in the 20th century you had an age of public intellectuals, people like George Orwell and Isaiah Berlin and Arthur Koestler, Albert Camus and Jean Paul Sartre, and in the 21st century you can't name a similar figure. Richard Dawkins, perhaps, but I think you can. I think there are public intellectuals in the 21st century, but they're very, very different. They're not Oxford dons, they're not radical journalists,
yeah.
They're millionaires, and you can find them on TED Talk, and they're people like Richard Branson or James Caan of Dragon's Den. Yeah. And what they have to say is, here's how you can be rich if you do these things, and here's how markets can be not just a source of private wealth creation, but they can be a public good. And free markets will save the world. Free markets will save us from global warming. If we expand free markets to the Middle East, I know we've tried this one, but it'll get rid of the terrorists, or it'll do this, it'll do that, it'll cure lumbago, what have you. And ever since the end of communism, ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have this one way of thinking. And no wonder that public intellectuals really are those. I mean, there are a few dissenting voices, but the majority of them are those that articulate one core argument that markets are magic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, like you say, there was an economic element there, but and I guess that's kind of like, that was, we had the sort of the Great Depression, and now we've got what they're calling the Great Recession. Neither of them really that great for anyone, but but if you look back, a very similar kind of lead up to it, perhaps that the orthodoxy was almost unquestioned and unchallenged, and you mentioned the book leading up to sort of the late 20s, just saying to buy shares, and then we've had the context of a bubble of house prices, of internationalization, globalization. We've had a lot of people who kind of probably or certainly the very strong impression given that we were headed down a particular right path, and then but there were some people who looked ahead and did say and were warning because the challenge, of course, with companies like Enron and the culture and banks, culture in lots of different places. So there's two kind of really interesting kind of examples that are both very similar, that have affected millions of people. And I guess the question, and I guess it'll tie quite nicely into where we're going to go, because even by considering this really, or by looking at by drawing attention to, say, a majority, because I guess an orthodoxy probably has to have certain characteristics, one of which it's held to be true by a certain number of people, perhaps questioning of that does make one somewhat heretical.
Yeah, well, this is true. I mean, I think orthodoxies are obviously immensely powerful. They are, and I think they are kind of what you would call received wisdom. They are common sense, or they appear to be common sense. I think it was Roland Barthes that sort of talked about how the common sense is arrived at by taking really kind of the history and politics out of a particular situation. I mean, we now have takes the example of bringing up children. The majority of received wisdom 30 or 40 years ago was, well, of course you hit them if they're naughty. This is now a very kind of marginal view, and it's fascinating to me. This is what I love about history, and particularly looking at social and cultural history, how and why these orthodoxies change over time. And I don't think it's any one incident where somebody saw a child being belted in Asda for crying. it's about generational shift and changes in education and affluence and that sort of thing, and that the knowledge that we are party to. And I think normally those changes happen before the law changes. I mean, if you look at the 1960s, the legalization of homosexuality, abortion, and the end of the death penalty were all done by Roy Jenkins. Well, they weren't done by him. He enabled MPs to put private members' bills through the House, through Harold Wilson's Labour government, and he gave them parliamentary time for them to be heard. And he was actually quite a conservative with a small c guy. But he had a sense that really this was the mark of a civilized society. And so I like how exploring how historical and cultural change hinges on these kind of moments. But I think the reason why he did it as well is that the social climate was changing before anyway. Politicians always tend to act kind of afterwards, after the conditions in which they can act have already been born. But on the subject of heretics, yeah, I mean, I guess heretics are those who are defiant of orthodoxies. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I mean, the original heretic is Martin Luther, but the kind of the mark of heresy, really, modern heresy, is to challenge orthodoxies and to be willing to stand up to kind of opprobrium and hatred and all sorts. I'm trying to think of a good example of a heretic at the moment. It'll come back to me on that one.
Well, perhaps the example you gave earlier of just being perhaps looking at the immigration in a different perspective.
Yes, yeah.
Because like you say, there's such a big number of people who would be perhaps to take that as orthodox, that there is some threat there. That going against that, given the culture now, probably is slightly heretical. Certainly, given perhaps the political and the newspaper culture that you mentioned.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's that old adage, isn't it, that people will generally not thank you for things they don't already know, and will be pleased for you to reinforce their biases. Anyway, I'm not suggesting that I don't have biases and with a small p prejudices, prejudgments. Of course I do. I'm a human beings are judging machines. Is how we've survived and managed to evade sort of big grizzly bears 20,000, 50,000, 100,000 years ago. I think 100,000 years ago, if you ran into a tribe and you weren't sure who they were, they would probably make short work of you. So having the ability to prejudge, I probably think I don't like you. At some point was evolutionary and adaptive, but right now it's one of the kind of the great dangers of our time. Really, the less of that we do, so much the better.
Yeah.
But there you go. But yeah, I mean, I was reading something very interesting recently. I've been writing a book on post-war Britain. It's just a textbook, and it was writing about the climate in 1945. And coming back to the question of the work of markets and things like that. In 1945, if you had said to somebody, I don't think the state is very much use and it gets in the way and it's an awfully cumbersome thing, and if we get rid of welfare and don't create this thing that the NHS that people are talking about and all that, well, we'll return to prosperity. They would have laughed. The prevailing thinking was that, having gone through the Great Depression and having gone through World War II, in which the state expanded massively to control all aspects of the economy, really, because we have to win a total war against Nazism, fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. The state was seen as the magic bullet, and there was only a tiny number of fringe kind of intellectuals, economists, and politicians at the end of the war who thought otherwise. One of them was, the young chemistry student at Oxford, Margaret Thatcher, who got hold of Friedrich von Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. And in The Road to Serfdom, Hayek said basically, he had fled Nazism, and he said, well, the thing about the Nazis is that they have this big state, and the bigger the state, the less the power the individual has, and therein is the product of tyranny. Now, if you look at an awful lot of rhetoric these days about the workings of the state, and particularly if you look at people like the Tea Party in America, they believe this as an article of faith and orthodoxy, if you will. And it went from being a heresy to, in certain parts of the world, currently an orthodox point of view. So the heretic and the dominant way of thinking are both sometimes one and the same. It's fascinating. And similarly, the Keynesian way of looking at things, that the state can intervene to iron out slumps and stop booms and manage the economy. Keynes thought that the economy is this immensely, market forces are immensely powerful things. I guess the analogy would be like something like plutonium. It's very powerful, but unless you manage it properly, it can be destructive. You need to kind of harness it in order to create prosperity. And the kind of the free marketeer said, no, let it go, let it do as it wants. It's like a thing of nature. so
absolutely.
But
so Nick, I mean, in terms of that thinking, those examples, what you're saying is that it can be quite and it can flow probably quite quickly over a period of time from orthodoxy to heresy, and maybe even back to orthodoxy again, depending on the climate, depending on the context, depending on perhaps economic factors, war, different social trends. I mean, I guess now the world is technologically very different, so some of those things, I mean, you can see opinions change now. People can sort of get themselves into jobs and out of jobs just to putting a comment, just making an inadvertent comment on or an incorrect comment or whatever on some social media. So it's there is quite an ebb and flow, isn't there, to orthodoxy and heresy?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the challenges of the internet age, I'll be fascinated in 20 years' time to see somebody writing a history of our times now, is the viral nature of knowledge. Now, it used to be that you went to a kind of like a font of wisdom, an intellectual who was an authority on a particular subject, and you would buy their book or listen to their radio program and watch them on TV. And one of the things that's happened with the internet is we have this democratization of knowledge. Now, this has great potential. The conversation you and I are having now, 20 years ago, just would not have been possible. It would have been two blokes in a pub talking, over a packet of pork scratchings, But so this aspect of things, is good and positive, and there are countless people out there sharing knowledge and sharing ideas, and you've got this, I think, this flourishing of all sorts of interesting ideas online. The democratization of knowledge as well enables all sorts of red herrings to kind of perpetuate themselves virally. I mean, there's been this business recently of those Britain First fascists. They are, people who are considered, slightly too inept to be in the British National Party, have been putting these memes online saying, if you support our lads out there fighting for our freedoms, like this, and then it's a like for this far-right party's website, and information travels so fast, so virally, and there are people who who post things online that are patently, wildly inaccurate or ill-informed or untrue or what have you, and so that is kind of, I guess, not even a concern, but something that's really going to shape the way kind of ideas develop, and perhaps stymie the development of kind of ideas and knowledge. There might be this whole internet of junk ideas later on.
Yeah.
But if you look back at the explosion of knowledge in Britain really was with the advent of printing and literacy, which, you know, the 17th century really. And if you look during the time of the Civil War, the number of pamphlets that are whizzing around London with kind of all sorts of crazy things on them, like the Earl of Strafford or the King, they are in league with the devil, and, you know, that there are all sorts of dark forces at work, whipping people up to do extraordinary and very violent things periodically. This kind of has always been with us, you know. You look at during the time of the French Revolution. I'm picking some really bloody examples here. I hope none of these things are going to happen. But during the time of the French Revolution, similarly, there's this roaring trade in kind of rather saucy kind of postcards and pictures and drawings and pamphlets going around, which have kind of a political content to them as well, and are sort of satirising Marie Antoinette and the King and humiliating them. But the thing about London during, Britain, England during the Civil War, and France, particularly during the French Revolution, is they're rife with rumour and conjecture and assumptions, much of which aren't true. Some of it is, much of which it isn't. So I guess this is, we just have it on a kind of a digital global scale now.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, yeah, I mean, and that's that in terms now. You know, I mean, it's you're right. I mean, ideas maybe can be circulated arguably quicker now. Lots of ideas could be circulated quicker, and perhaps with the advent of social media, things can become orthodox. You know, in the sense of a lot of people subscribing to them. You know, those memes. You know, perhaps you see things like, the bucket of water that people are popping over their heads. You know, just there are things, aren't there? You know, selfies. There are all these kind of examples of things that may be small, but perhaps if you look at it, if you look deeper, because this is one of the questions I was going to ask you, is to be able how one could identify an orthodoxy, or the set of orthodoxies or the set of memes that are prevalent, because if we, because social media and the internet is so prevalent now, those kind of, it's almost like implicit that ideas are going to be going round. And for a lot of people, if the ideas go round enough or they see it enough, then that does almost in their mind become a, become a fact. So I'm wondering how you kind of almost like, you don't have to, not sort of not vaccinate yourself or inoculate yourself against that kind of orthodoxy. You don't necessarily be a heretic, but just what kind of thinking processes, certainly in a modern context or in terms of historical context, you could use to identify orthodoxy?
Well, I think you have to be a dissenting consumer of knowledge. I mean, I may have swallowed a few orthodoxies myself that are, and it's not to say all orthodoxies are wrong anyway. There are some fairly standard ways of looking at history, which I think, that's probably true. I think you have to be a dissenting consumer of knowledge. You have to look at, where the information you're being given is coming from, and who is benefiting from the dissemination of that information. This isn't to say become a conspiracy theorist, because I think this is kind of another thing that the internet is churning out, and it's probably not amazingly helpful for understanding the world. One of the things about conspiracy theories is they're conjecture in the absence of knowledge, and very often you have to take circumstantial evidence to make it do an awful lot of work for you, and it's really leads down all sorts of kind of alleyways that aren't very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Some conspiracy theories are becoming virtually orthodoxies of their very own. And I think actually accepting that there's a gap in knowledge, this is very frightening for people. And I think it's something we need to do more and more often. Take the example of 9/11, for example. There's all sorts of stuff about that seems very peculiar to me. It doesn't make sense. And, maybe there is a conspiracy there. I don't know. But the point is that I don't know. Mm-hmm. And I would love for it to be, some secret kind of, the Illuminati or something like that. It would make life so much more interesting and exciting. But I don't know. I think I read a very good book on the subject, by the way. If anyone who's out there and interested in 9/11, read The Looming Tower by Lawrence Wright, and the impression you get from that is that there's an enormous institutional bungle between the CIA and the FBI, and had they put the pieces that they had together, they would probably have caught the hijackers before it all began. That seems like a more compelling argument to me.
Yeah.
But looking at accepting where there are just absences of knowledge, then that can direct people to actually find the knowledge, to do the kind of the evidence gathering, the research, and to create robust theories that will stand the test of time.
Yeah.
I think another thing to do is if you're being a dissenting consumer of knowledge, let's pick a well-worn topic like the causes of World War I. You need, and somebody posts online something about the causes of World War I. You're ill-equipped to really deal with that unless you have kind of educated yourself in the canon of knowledge, the kind of the backlist of arguments that go all the way back probably to about the 1920s. Now that's obviously a lot of reading, but there are a couple of key titles that you can really absorb and give yourself enough to look at ideas and think, well, that one doesn't really kind of fit. I mean, in orthodoxy, that's or maybe it's a heresy. I don't know. Michael Gove's recent utterances on World War I, whether it was this kind of magnificent war for democracy. Well, if you look at the fact that 40% of the soldiers from Britain who fought couldn't vote anyway, and there's not very much written from soldiers' diaries or letters home saying, "I'm doing this for democracy." They weren't writing those kinds of things. So simply looking at that, you can go, well, what you're saying doesn't. I mean, maybe you've got evidence that I haven't seen. Maybe you have some kind of access to the National Archives, Michael Gove, that I'm not party to, but I suspect not. Otherwise, you'd have told me. So those kinds of things can help you challenge these opinions espouted. And I think it's about having that not dismissive, but kind of inquiring stance as to what's being told to you, having the kind of a slightly sceptical detachment when you see things posted online, because it may well be complete rubbish.
Yeah. No, exactly, and I think that's really useful. I mean, I think there are, and I think, I guess philosophically one could sort of debate it quite considerably, but there are, for instance, with 9/11 and the World War I and World War II, there are a certain sort of probably corpus of facts that we could, corpus of knowledge that we could say, perhaps with certain dates or certain events that took place, certain key individuals, perhaps where you would start getting into discussions is the relative importance of certain events and people and treaties and so on and so forth. I remember when we were doing. I remember the origins of the origins of the Second World War. And one of the books, I think it was A.G.P. Taylor's one that we got given at school. The argument there was that that it really wasn't so much Hitler. It was the stance, the stance of basically, just sitting back and watching and not really intervening, just kind of, and whilst that's very easy to, a lot of people would sort of disagree with that, and you could, at least there is some agreement of some core facts there, and then the interpretation of it just shows that there are different ways, different ways to do that. Whereas, there's probably a step on, isn't there, where there are people who perhaps deny moon landings and so on and so forth, which would be a hard, which is a whole different level. That's not really even kind of. I mean, on one level, I guess that is heresy, but there's no kind of, there'd be probably less evidence or less robust evidence, perhaps, for some of those arguments.
Yeah, I mean, there's this thing. It was really interesting. I was listening to a radio interview with a academic from Cardiff's journalism department at a time when one of the papers in Wales had printed a story which had catastrophic consequences about the MMR vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing this academic was saying, he said that newspapers sometimes take two positions, 2 points of view, and present them as being equally valid. Now, the one position that there is no link between MMR and autism has acres of peer-reviewed science behind it. 90% of the world's experts believe that there just isn't a link. And a couple of cranks, one of whom has been widely discredited and I think possibly disbarred from working now, have produced evidence which looks very exciting at first glance, but really, if you're an expert, there's no basis to it, and it's flawed research. But I'm not a scientist. I don't know anything about MMR. I don't know anything about autism. And if I'm reading the newspaper and I'm presented with these two things as being, well, they're just two opinions, therefore they are equally valid, you decide. What am I going to do? I'm instinctively hardwired to go for the frightening thing. Oh, that's scary. That's a threat. That's a threat to my child. I'm going to have to keep them away from that thing. Possible that it's not a threat, but human beings didn't evolve, so it's possible the bear isn't going to attack me. Yes. We look at the frightening thing, and it's really irresponsible. I mean, hugely irresponsible on the part of whoever's writing that story to present things in that light. And again, this is one of the dangers of the internet. I mean, I wonder how many of the people watching this today will have had a sore throat and gone out there and asked Dr. Google and come back with terrible diagnoses because of this. There was this democratization of knowledge out there, and no filtering system. Oh, I suppose there are some filtering systems. There are some people. There are some sort of ways of going, this is good knowledge, that's bad knowledge. I mean, you have TripAdvisor, for example. But there's an effective media should help us filter knowledge so that we can navigate the world more effectively. And sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes, in fact, the opposite happens, which is, again, terrible, really.
Well, that's a good example of kind of current history where the orthodoxy has created such a big kind of impact on people. I mean, with that particular thing, there was certainly one of the journalists, one of the original stories locally was in one of the papers in Swansea. Some very concerned parents, a mum in particular, led a sort of campaign to stop kids being sort of inoculated, all those years ago. And we had recently, only kind of last year, where a situation where measles, there was a higher kind of outbreak of measles, which is not germ measles but measles, which is potentially deadly. I can't remember, it's 1 in 1,000 or something, but it's very, very serious illness, purely because in that particular geographical area, less people had because of fear and because obviously people want to do the best for their children. They chose not to become immunised. And the interesting thing is that in a kind of day and age where people are, a lot of people are busy. The average, a lot of people kind of, they're turning, the newspaper will be, for better or worse, providing that orthodoxy or that snippet of orthodoxy in that particular area for them. Still have a fear and a resistance to that. So you're right. It's got a good kind of modern maybe example of that, and where heresy is potentially life-saving for people. It has its place. Asking questions.
Yes, and being the dissenting individual, the dissenting individual. I mean, in many ways, I suppose, if you go back to the kind of the religious origin of heresy, I suppose Jesus Christ is the first heretic of them all, really. It's this dissenting figure that says, this is not. I've been sent here by my father. This is not what he meant, guys. Definitely not. So yeah, I wonder if we're going to get a few emails about that one. Maybe. Yeah, I'd say one great topic we should do in the future is look at kind of scares and moral panics. That fascinates me now, things like the moral panic surrounding things like kind of punk or mods in the 60s. Why did people take these extreme attitudes towards kids with dyed hair. Anyway, there's a story for another time.
No, definitely. Well, that would be great. Well, I think it's really so. I think what's fascinating about that topic, and also with this, you can look back and you can see that even in a very short period of time, that things are changing, and perhaps like with the democratization of knowledge now, there is an opportunity to develop new orthodoxies that there wasn't in the past, because I guess and it probably depends on which period you look at, but I'm guessing sort of in the UK, sort of, maybe, or if we went back, to the time of the Glorious Revolution, I guess the church would have had quite a big impact on what was believable, and I guess also in terms of the monarchy and so forth, and probably there was a lot less opportunity to dissent, just economically and also politically, and also if you wanted to keep your head as well, but
Yeah.
things are changing, and I think it's really interesting now that when you think of that, who does create the orthodoxies now, and where do they come from, and probably one could look at perhaps some of you mentioned millionaires, marketers, perhaps social media, the internet, where else are orthodoxies being created now?
Well, I think they're a dynamic process. I don't think that it's possible to sit down and go, right, I want to create a new economic orthodoxy to impose on the world. I mean, the example of Friedrich Hayek, that I mentioned earlier on. Yeah, he was a man of ardent opinion, and he collected powerful people around him and said, you guys need to be disseminating these ideas. But it was only until the economic climate made those ideas viable, the unions and the inflation of the 1970s and the economic crisis, that the seed of the idea found fertile soil. And I think people have been, things like, for example, inequality. People have been going on about that for the last 5-10 years, and I think now only the soil is only now fertile for the idea to really kind of to flower. And I think if, for example, if Scotland votes votes for independence on Thursday, it's going to be a huge mandate vote, really, on the way the country's been run since 2010, and I think it will have massive shockwaves for parties that are pro-austerity, for example. And I think, well, these are theorizations, but in answer to the question, really, I think where orthodoxies develop, they develop as not sort of one lone preacher in Hyde Park Corner saying this is how the world should be. They develop as kind of relational kind of changes. You do have the lone preachers in Hyde Park Corner ranting, but it has to have the audience there, and the audience has to be big, and the message has to travel fast, so the audience has to kind of already be thinking these things.
Yeah.
There was a brilliant example put forward by Dominic Sandberg when he did a documentary on Britain in the 70s, and he said that Margaret Thatcher didn't create Thatcherism. She didn't create Thatcherite Britain in 1979. Thatcherite Britain was already evolving in the 1970s, and it created her. And the generation of people that were owning their own homes, having a bit more money in their pockets, they're being a bit more affluent, and less tied to the old working class institutions of the union and the social club and the pub and the church hall and that kind of thing, and wanted to live in suburbia with 2 cars and a nice new fridge freezer and things like that. Those affluent people saw something in Margaret Thatcher when she was when she deposed Ted Heath in 1975, and saw something in her, and they created her. And I think that's probably more accurate. And I think obviously there is, there's her as a central figure as well, as both a heretic and an orthodox later on. And there has to be this kind of relationship between the follower and the followed, the followers and the followed, so to speak. And that's where I think it comes from, and the context that surrounds them. So it's not a very neat answer, I'm afraid, Richard.
No, but I think that's really, but that's much more. That makes sense, doesn't it? Because you could apply, to understand the orthodoxy, you need to look at the context, the politics, the economics, try and understand the existing times, try and understand what came before, what led up to that. That those things may have evolved over a period of time, and and like you say, that there is an audience there, that perhaps culturally or socially, there's some kind of receptivity there. There couldn't be perhaps, we've discussed the possibility that there is, or depending on how widespread it is, but some xenophobia or some concern about foreigners, in the current climate, coming over, the arguments that have been, were been put many years ago about jobs being lost or whatever in Britain, but that argument wouldn't be able to, or that orthodoxy or that meme couldn't even start to sort of come out through certain channels unless there were certain economic circumstances, or even just an existing fear. That the audience is there, and then the idea can kind of build, but the idea can build upon it. If people are suddenly struggling financially, then and we've seen this. There's probably a lot of examples, probably in terms of First World War, certainly Second World War. In terms of financial struggles giving rise to opportunities for new orthodoxies to come, some of which are quite undemocratic.
Yeah, I mean the thing that the kind of the unpleasant paradox for Westminster politicians at the moment, I think, is that Gordon Brown demonstrated this to his downfall really in the last election, is that yes, this racism is horrible and unpalatable and nasty and ugly, and yet the people who are articulating these unpleasant views, it's not because they were born evil. It's because they do have certain anxieties, and it does appear to be real to them. And there was that woman in Manchester where he called her just not racist or bigoted or whatever. And yet, what she was trying to say, probably not very articulately, and probably not in a slightly inept way, she was trying to say is that this has changed our lives. This has, affected us, and we don't like it. This isn't what we remember.
Yeah.
And how you deal with that, I don't know. That's a question for somebody actually better at economics and politics than me. But certainly, the answer that is the way that that demographic is shifting. They're shifting towards being UKIP voters. The great trick, it's a bit like Satan, really, Nigel Farage. The great trick with his cult is that his economically, he is about liberalising markets, particularly labour markets, more than ever. He's about wiping out vast tracts of the welfare state and bringing us back to stovepipe hats, mutton chops, and the good old days of the Victorians with tuberculosis. And yet, the people who vote for him think that he's a good bloke who's going to protect them from all these awful foreigners and, build a brick wall around Britain and, bring things back to the good old days. So he's very, very canny in the way that he's presented these things. But there you go.
Fantastic. Well, Nick, I think, as we're looking, and we will definitely anyone watching should definitely we'll do another one of these in the very near future. But I think for there is, one doesn't necessarily, you don't necessarily need to be a heretic or an orthodox, but although I'm sure there has been a modicum of heresy espoused today. But being able to look back and being able to look at those factors, those relational factors, the context, try and understand what ideas are prevalent, where they have come from, and to look at their, if you're not looking necessarily even at their validity, but looking at their impact and understanding it, then that can only be a very healthy thing for not just the student of history, but the student of psychology. Pretty much, the person who wants to you know, have good judgment. You know, to have that.
Any deficiency of knowledge, really.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Nick, thank you so much for your for your time today. For anyone else who wants to get some more information on Nick, explaininghistory.com is a good place to go. Anywhere else they should go to check you out, Nick?
Check it out there, and there's a link on that site through to the podcast and through to my little growing YouTube channel. Anyone wants to drop me a line, it's always info@explaininghistory.com. So if you're studying out there and you want some help or advice with history, always drop me a line, every email answered. And if you just got some kind of out there observations on the modern world, I love hearing about those as well.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, there's a lot, I should mention, there's a lot of great resources, great free resources, as well as your podcast, some really cool handouts and stuff on explaininghistory.com. But also, you're quite keen, aren't you, Nick? If there are any topics that people would like to know more about that they think would be good, then we can, you know, you're open to doing a podcast on that, and perhaps we can have a conversation about that. So, fantastic, Nick. Listen, Nick Shepley, thank you so much for your time today.
You too, Rich. Right.
I'll speak to you soon.
Right.